This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with author and professor Joel Kotkin his latest book, The New Class Conflict. Joel Kotkin is the Roger Hobbs Distinguished Fellow in Urban Studies at Chapman University and is the executive editor of the widely read website New Geography. He's a recognized authority on global economic, political, and social trends, and his most recent book is The Next 100 Million, America in 2050, which I also recommend. Joel, glad to have you on the program.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So, Joel, I'll just ask you a basic question coming from the title of the book. What is the new class conflict?
Well, the new class conflict is really about the changing nature of class in America, and it sort of goes beyond the sort of the 1% against the 99%, which is really kind of a gross oversimplification, and talks about the rise of a new ruling class, which is predominantly coming out of the tech world, telecommunications, and the rise of a group that I call the Clerisy, which is the universities, the upper bureaucracy, and the large parts of the media, and you have a conflict between that establishment and the old establishment, which is pretty much I think been won by the first group. And then also about what's happening to the middle class in the process. And the middle class in America is the term I use, and it's so interesting. It was also used in a very interesting book about Weimar Germany, which is the proletarianization of the middle class. In other words, people, even if they're in quotes comfortable, are actually very insecure, don't have great feelings about the future for themselves, and certainly not for their children. And you have this kind of sense of displacement that is going throughout the middle class, and then you, of course, are beginning to see parts of the middle class begin to drop as opposed to rise. And I think that's the biggest issue facing the country.
Why should we be concerned about this particular ruling class? I mean, there have always been throughout American history different groups, constellations of forces, business interests working their way into the political arena as well, who have, in effect, ruled America for a period. And this is a part of our story. It's a part of our history. Now we have a new group, largely formed by entrepreneurial capital a generation ago, that coalesced really in Silicon Valley and in Seattle.
Right.
What's new about them? Why are they this problem that you identify in your book that, in a sense, is threatening something very vital about America, namely upward mobility?
Well, first of all, I mean, this is very parallel to what we saw at the turn of the 20th century, which was the rise of the industrial ruling class, which also had to be curbed eventually, or we would have had all sorts of social and economic problems. And now we're at another turn, and that turn is basically in favor of the sort of tech, media part of the economy. The dangerous part of it is that one. And remember, there was certainly major problems with the old industrial elites. The problem we have here is by their ability to control the messaging, essentially to control the information pipelines, gives them enormous amounts of power and influence. Henry Ford may have been a terrible person, but really all he wanted you to do was buy his car. Facebook wants to inform your life and every aspect of your life. Google even more so. And so what you end up with is a kind of power that we've not seen before, because the technology to enforce that power did not exist before. And so I think that's a big part of the problem. Very heavily concentrated. Only a few companies dominate almost every major niche. It's also very geographically concentrated, as you mentioned, in Silicon Valley, with a sort of if you will, an annex in the Seattle area. The rest of the country has almost no input at all, and that's something I think that is worrisome. I think it's very dangerous when you have a group of young people in their 20s and 30s with billions of dollars at their disposal. They haven't gone through a lot. They may not have great judgment. Their life experiences are very limited. Whereas in some ways, at least the old industrial capitalists, had to go through usually a pretty rough period. And the other thing is the labor content. The labor content is very small in the tech industry. A lot of it is what I call in the book techno coolies, which are H-1B visa people brought in for a temporary period of time, and you don't have anything like the kind of mass employment that the steel and aerospace and even today the energy industry has generated over time. So there really are very, very few avenues for upward mobility in a society dominated by these tech companies. And one other very important thing, the old industrial guys, again, with many, many negatives about them, nevertheless needed a middle-class consumer. They needed people to buy cars, to buy houses, to buy washing machines, to fly on airplanes. The new tech oligarchs, if you want to use that term, which I do, they don't. All they need is somebody who can afford an iPhone. The need for a real middle class is actually declining because they don't really need a middle class. And in some ways, actually, if people who spend their lives on Facebook ever got a life, it wouldn't be so good for Facebook.
So the claim would be Facebook wants you to be a part of their script instead of really creating your own.
Exactly. I mean, it's it's very much like Dave Eggers' book, The Circle. I mean, it kind of a scary Orwellian aspect to this, and one that produces relatively little economic growth for other sectors of the economy. Technology, I started covering Silicon Valley in 1975. In those days, you were taking technology and you were putting it, into how you ran a business, but you also were putting it into aerospace, into numerical controlled equipment. Otherwise, you could see where technology was really literally making life much better for people. Today, am I convinced that all these kids walking around with their faces in the phone, is this necessarily something that's making the country richer, more productive?
Yeah,
I kind of doubt it.
Yeah, no, I think the question asks and answers itself. It's interesting on that score. I was at a retreat a few years back, and one of the speakers was Peter Thiel, early investor in PayPal and also Twitter. And he made the statement that by Silicon Valley's own standards, it had failed. That is, if it had meant through its investment and technology and engineering to actually progress society to scientific innovation, medical innovations, it had not done that. And one certainly, and he included himself, things like Facebook and PayPal and Twitter, whatever they do, certainly aren't, moving the country towards greater standards of living or ease or expectations or things like that. We're just really talking to one another more and really participating or facilitating, I guess, vanity in some ways. So your point there is well heard. Let me ask you kind of a standard economic question. What makes these guys impervious to economic competition? Now, I mean, with Microsoft, the answer was always during the antitrust trial was network effects. But with Google and Facebook, it seems, so we talk about their economic concentration and then the power of their owners, but is there something about them that they won't be knocked off eventually or soon?
Well, it's very possible, and I say in the book that it's, in the new class conflict that there's clearly, 10 years from now, could Google be replaced by somebody else? Conceivably. But whoever replaces it is going to be from the same group of investors, unless they're coming from China. The same group of investors, probably in the same area, probably with many of the exact same people. And also it just seems to be in the scalability of these technologies that it just doesn't seem to promote sort of a dispersion of opportunity. Like if you remember the early days, I don't know how old you are, but in the early days of the PC revolution, which I covered pretty closely, there were lots of little companies. You could choose word processing from 3 or 4 or 5 different companies. There were There were always new things coming out all the time. Remember that one time there were dozens of disk drive companies, sort of capitalist innovation and productivity writ large. You don't have that anymore. And I would also argue that because they have such huge market shares, Google has over 80% of search, they don't really have to innovate. And actually, their new mission is to make it that you have to use them for everything. And they want your personal information to sell for advertisers. Well, I don't see the great social purpose that's being done here. You're literally taking from what existed into something new, but you're not necessarily, making it any more productive or any easier to use. And anyone who, like me, has been on Microsoft, you dread every new iteration of Windows.
Yeah.
I know tech guys whose career is stripping Windows 8 out to put Windows 7 back in.
Yeah.
Because Windows 8 is an impossible program to, it is unbelievably terrible. I have a Surface, and I don't use it, even though it has some good functionality, because the Windows program is so inconsistent. I never know what's going to open and what's not going to open. In other words, they haven't made it any better. I think there are very few people today who would think that Microsoft has gotten any better since XP.
Now, I want to get into some broader aspects of your assessment here that you offer. And one part of that is the Clerisy, which we might think of, and you kind of describe as a secular religious counterpart to this business class, and they're able to reinforce through their ability to manipulate symbols and arguments and themes and ideology, and reinforce kind of a new progressive vision. So that's one part of your critique, but maybe we'll just stick here on a basic point here. So this idea in your book of proletarianization of the middle class are we saying there's some sort of direct causal relationship between the rise of these Silicon Valley companies, or is there something else going on? And is the something else not so much the rise of a new class? Is it just really bad economic policies that we've had since 2008 that haven't, at the margins, increased wealth, opportunity, jobs for people? We're just kind of getting used to 2% growth, and it's the consequences fall out down the line. And then if you stack that with kind of our debt structure, both our government debt and then the huge personal debts people have racked up, we're just in a really bad funk right now.
Well, I think some of these things certainly predate President Obama, and can probably be traced back at least to 2001. But I think that part of what you're seeing is that the cost of doing things, this is relating to the Clerisy, has gone up. The quality of education has gone down. The flow of information is more stilted than it's been since I can recall. I'm an old journalist. I used to work at the Washington Post. I open up back in the 70s and early 80s. I open up a New York Times today, and I read an article, and I say, my editor would have shot me for writing something like this. In other words, not even an attempt to have a free discussion. Now you have anybody who doesn't agree with every aspect of the climate change agenda is a denier, like somebody who denies the Holocaust, and is wished out into a cornfield. Other words, the quality of the debate is very weak. And then in terms of economic policy, and I don't think this was the intention of the president, certainly, but I think it's the way it turned out. Ultra low interest rates and free money for rich people. How does that work? Well, that works in making rich people richer and driving up the cost of assets. So the biggest crisis facing the middle class, for instance, today is the fact that in many parts of the country, homes are completely unaffordable.
Yeah.
I live in Los Angeles. I'm embarrassed by what my house is worth. But if I want to stay in Southern California, there's no bargain. There's no place to go. And I think that and then for young people, obviously it's even going to be worse because they don't have the assets to buy anything. So I think that we've had a policy which has been very, very good for a very small percentage of the population. We've had a policy that's been pretty bad for Main Street, very good for Wall Street, and all the effects of that throughout the class structure. Whatever the great weaknesses of America in the 50s and even into the 60s and even as late as the Clinton era, is that our capitalist system did redound to the middle and working classes. There was opportunity to move up. That opportunity is very constricted now. And then on top of it, you have this Clerisy, which is extremely expensive, makes it very difficult to do things. If you take a state like California, where I live, it's so difficult to start anything without a bunch of lawyers, environmental impact reports, a whole series of things that make it very difficult. So a lot of times I'll talk to a real estate group, and they'll just say, "Well, we used to do things in California. We don't do them anymore because the amount of regulatory excess is so great that you simply can't do it." And the Clerisy, a big part of the Clerisy in the country, in California, but also in the rest of the country and in the federal government, is this upper bureaucracy, which is increasingly ideological and very, very powerful, and very often motivated for political reasons. I mean, so President Obama's government by decree, is not ahistorical given what's going on.
Yeah. On this point of the Clerisy, you would say major figures in the media, academics, people in the administrative state, et cetera, major foundations who are really able to kind of, there's something about what they're saying, they are really impervious or in denial about the need for economic growth, or they really don't want it to happen. I take it. Your state of California would be good because people have been fleeing. I mean, it's well noted. I'm sure you've noted the cost of renting a truck to go from California to Texas, much more expensive than to go from Texas to California. So people are fleeing. There are constant op-eds in the Wall Street Journal of CEOs saying they don't do business in California anymore, and yet nothing really seems to change. And then, people note California is really a top-bottom state now in terms of state government priorities.
Right. And I think that the country is making a lot of the same moves. I think, unfortunately, this is an area where California has been ahead of the game, but it's a similar situation in many other parts of the country and will become more so. You take, for instance, the policy on energy. If you impose a policy on energy which pretty much forces you to move, as the Germans have, into a huge investment into renewables, and no natural gas, and or trying to restrain natural gas, restrain nuclear power, you're going to have very expensive energy, which is going to trickle down throughout the economy. It's going to make it very, very difficult for middle-class jobs to be created, not just in energy, but in manufacturing and logistics. And, of course, you're going to add enormous amount of costs to the average middle-class household. So, this really has a direct effect on the class structure. If you're Tom Steyer, what do you care if gasoline is $20 a gallon? You really could care less. Yeah. It's irrelevant to you.
Except for when you are making money on it.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, that's a different thing too.
Yeah.
But in other words, you have groups of people to whom high housing prices, high energy prices, lack of middle class upward mobility jobs simply doesn't matter. And in some cases, I would say they actually would rather there wasn't. I mean, Look, what would be the ultimate dream of the San Francisco oligarchy would be to see the entire Central Valley disappear tomorrow. Yeah. Maybe have a few organic farms to feed them and for their fancy restaurants. But this way there'll be no traffic. Once you get past Oakland, it would be just empty. And I think that there just isn't this ideal of there being a place for upward mobility and a middle class. It's just, it doesn't matter. And it's not that these are evil people. they just don't even think about it or care about it. And this is part of what happens with Silicon Valley and with the geography that we have now, which is they live in a world where everybody agrees with them on everything.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no debate. I mean, that's one of the things I find very, very frightening, is we're not even debating these issues anymore. This is just accepted truth. Science has spoken. Well, I'm sorry, my father was a doctor and a scientist, and as he used to say to me, you know what? You know who killed the most people in the world? Doctors, because we didn't know what we were doing. Well, maybe you ought to just kind of keep an open mind that maybe some things that you're saying are not entirely true. But we've seen this supplanting of religious certainty with this sort of secular certainty. And it has a very debilitating effect on the debate, how we deal with things, and how we understand the world.
Here we really get into your chapter, Valley of the Oligarchs, which,
right.
And you have a phrase, it's not your phrase, but I like the idea that you quote Walter Russell Mead, the Downton Abbey vision of America's future,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have another concept on the same page, plutonomy. That
right.
really seems to feed in well to sort of the governing vision of this tech class that you're describing, and then of course they're sort of hand-in-glove allies, the Clerisy.
Right. Well, I think that alliance is a very important one, and I think that, what you end up with is you end up with people whose ideal. First of all, let's start with this: the tech oligarchs, the investment bankers. These are almost overwhelmingly people who came from well-to-do families to start with. They certainly upper middle class at very, very least. Went to very good schools, did well in those schools in most cases, have hung around people like themselves all their lives. One big difference is if you're a tech entrepreneur, you don't need working class people pretty much for anything except to clean your office. You're not like a aerospace company that needs machinists and electricians.
Yeah.
You don't need any of that stuff. And so you don't have anything to do with people like that. So, it's sort of almost more like something out of Max Weber. It's what is the world that you are surrounded with? It's like somebody who lives in, an old Jewish neighborhood or an old Chinese neighborhood can say, oh, well, America is, where there's a dim sum restaurant every 2 blocks. Well, but that's not what America is. This is an exception. These are people who are living in their own reality. Like I always hear this phrase, millennials all want to live in downtowns and they're all heading into the cities. So I said, okay, let's take a look at the census, find out where they are. Well, it turns out that about 8% of them live in dense urban areas. And then they'll say, well, but the more of them want to. Well, they don't move there in part because they're expensive, but also not everybody wants to live in a studio apartment in San Francisco or share a 2-bedroom apartment with 4 other people. A lot of people don't like that, and they don't want to do that, and they certainly don't want to do it as they get into their 30s. But if you live in a world in which everybody is in the same place and has essentially the same attitudes, one of the big changes I see in the media, when I first worked for the Washington Post many, many years ago, the guy sitting next to me was, his brother was a cop, and the working class Italian guy, and he had my editor was a former Marine, and these people brought a different consciousness into things. And what we see now in the media is you have fewer and fewer older people, you have fewer and fewer homeowners, fewer and fewer people with kids, fewer and fewer people without money. So the views of the media, I mean, sometimes I read the New York Times and they'll say something about where people want to live, and then I said, well, have you looked at the census?
Yeah, look at the data.
I mean, like they'll say something like, families are moving back into the cities, and they're going to be, that's going to be the big thing. Well, I just did the numbers on 5 to 14, and I know where they're going, and I know where they're growing. Yes, there are. If you live in Brooklyn and you see a bunch of baby carriages, and you think, wow, lots of people with kids in the city. But if you did the data analysis, you realize that this is actually a relatively small segment of the city population. In the case of Manhattan, the majority of the households are singles. They're not even married. So the distortive effect. And what's weird is, given the internet, you would think we would have all this input coming from all over. But actually, the media has consolidated just as tech has consolidated. And it really is in Washington, New York, and somewhat in the Bay Area. And the rest of the country might as well not exist.
And you know it. I mean, we began this interview. You made the comment of the ability to control information, and of course, we've recently seen some of the early tech entrepreneurs who have done quite well getting into the media business, the media space, and buying their own newspapers. I mean, I'm sure that will continue, and so I suppose it gets worse. And of course, how many journalists? There are a lot of lost journalist jobs. Of course, that seems inevitable with the rise of online journalism. But this, sort of would seem to contribute to what you're saying. Interesting, though. You would think, though, and many have said this, decentralized environment for communications that has to create a lot of opportunities for counter opposition. And of course, it was interesting. One of the things Jeff Bezos did coming into the Washington Post when he bought it is he brought in the libertarian lawyers at the Volokh conspiracy to the Washington Post, which a lot of people thought was an interesting move.
Well, I mean, I think that you will see among the tech community, and I think it will be an interesting division between those parts of the tech community that have really decided to essentially be part of the game. You have all these Obama people going to work for Uber or going to work for Apple.
Yeah.
And they're going to play the same crony capitalist game that the old companies did. And then you're going to have your sort of libertarian types who conceivably, if the Republican Party moved away from some of its more Neanderthal social views, might end up in that camp, depending on whether or not the Democratic Party goes further to the left, which I think is something that may very well happen. Because if you look at what's happened to the social base of the Democratic Party, ethnic minorities, traditional working class people, those people have done very, very badly in this economy. And although some may, particularly African Americans, may give a bye to President Obama because of his racial background, I don't think that they're going to support Martin O'Malley in this, or even Hillary Clinton in the same way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. Thinking just in terms of and this is something I wanted to ask you. Seems like there is it's a deceptively strong ruling class, and that it actually is you just noted, actually is a very narrow base in terms of who it has to appeal to and who it has to take into account, which would seem to make it incredibly vulnerable. And yet, we also noted the 2008 election seemed to be kind of a squaring off of elites, with largely elites who have made money from extraction or construction, squaring off with Silicon Valley, and we know who won. And then the Tea Party would be kind of the other element of opposition here. But it does seem, and of course there's also the red state and the blue state battles that are going on right now, and which have really proliferated during Obama's presidency. All of this seems to indicate there's a really healthy level of opposition to this group, if maybe we've been slow to recognize their power. You call this group the yeomanry. Talk about them for a minute and kind of what their long-term prospects are for recovery. Or recovering upward mobility, I should say.
Well, I mean, right now it doesn't look very good, because you have the Democratic Party, which has essentially signed on to a upstairs, downstairs, if you will, coalition. In other words, it services the needs of the very wealthy and their opinions on a lot of issues, and then it if you will, buys off the lower classes, sort of like the way Caesar paid off the mob in Rome. I mean, in other words, you redistribute enough wealth to the, and you have your bread and circuses, and you can have them on Facebook too.
Yeah.
And you sort of build your coalition that way. And the yeomanry are the small property owners, the small business people, some of the professionals. And they're almost by nature individualistic. They're not well organized. But I do think that there is the potential for this class of small property owners to rebel. The problem is they don't really have much of any kind of mechanism. I mean, the Tea Party, which I think started in a fairly promising way, has been hijacked, I think, a bit by the institutional right wing, who have their own agendas. I mean, I don't see why the Tea Party has to get into social issues, or why the Tea Party needs to even get into, to some extent, even into immigration. But they've gone that way. The other obviously the other example was Occupy Wall Street, and that seems to have faded tremendously. The power of the wealthy to control both political parties right now is very overwhelming. There is no figure in either party who seems to be able to transcend this. And so I think that the yeomanry are really kind of politically homeless right now, sort of flailing, and really don't have any kind of real champion.
Yeah, it seems, a part of your book and dealing with the yeomanry is also this slide, and others have discussed this as well, this sort of slide downward with kind of the decline of the family. And the rise of single-parent families, and also a related part of the millennials who seem to be cut out, or they have low rates of family formation, and we can understand why that is. It's understandable in part, and yet it kind of leads to this process that Alexis de Tocqueville described of individuals being largely closed into themselves and not active participants in the market with families and religious communities, community associations, et cetera. They're not actually out there expressing themselves and finding their voice and their way of life. They're kind of, in many cases, right? I mean, it's not just something that's been made up. I mean, the number of millennials living with their parents is staggering, particularly compared to past generations. And so, this also, I think, contributes to this sort of, feeling of not helplessness, but not even really knowing how to live in a free society as an independent citizen anymore. It seems, that seems to couple with also the feeling of the yeomanry of, oh my gosh, I don't know what tomorrow could bring.
Well, there's certainly, this if they, term sometimes used as failure to launch.
Yeah.
And what's dangerous is not only is the idea of living with their parents, but many of them making the choice, I'm not going to get married, or I'm not going to have kids, because it's too scary. It's not something that I feel I can fulfill. That's one of the reasons why you see such much higher rates of childbearing and family formation in states that are growing and are not ridiculously expensive, as opposed to those places that are very expensive. And I think you do have a
the dark gap, right? That's
and then we also have this this sort of the replacement of real commitment with virtual commitment. People get all excited about something that's online, but they're not actually doing anything. I mean, I find really interesting is, despite the complete PCization of the universities, I don't see a lot of demonstrations. Yeah. Compared to when I was at Berkeley in the early 70s, there's nothing. There's very little, activism of almost any kind now. And I think in a funny way, I think that's been, sort of like been diverted by the virtual media and by the experience. I mean, you see, kids walking around college campuses with their faces in the phones. They're not talking to each other. They're not even checking out the opposite sex. They're sort of living in this weird virtual universe. And I've seen this far more evolved in my time in Asia, where 30, 40, as many as 50% of all women, for instance, in Taiwan, have no intention of ever having children. And we could be moving into that direction. And what I've also found in my interviews, and this goes to the part of the book called The Geography of Inequality, is that what you find is when I was doing interviews, let's say in New York, a lot of times people say, you really have to choose between having a family and living in New York. You can't do both.
Yeah.
And so we'll have whole parts of the country, like San Francisco, like Manhattan, like parts of Brooklyn, where very few people end up having kids. And that's going to have huge ramifications on every level in years ahead. So one of the biggest problems with the decline of the yeomanry is the yeomanry was sort of the generator of families. And now their circumstances are so tough that they have to think, well, maybe having a family is not such a good idea.
Well, related to this, you note the decline of small business formation.
Right.
I mean, how do we understand that? Is that largely the result of policies coming out of the current administration? I mean, it seemed to me that it wasn't necessarily the case in the 90s. So I'm curious for your thoughts there. Also kind of related to this on the question of the decline in childbirth. So you've also got a generation of people who really can't think beyond their own being. I mean, I think that's kind of the effect of that. I mean, that's kind of what you see in Europe. It seems it's like, life itself ends with my death because I've really left nothing behind, and I'm not, the way, you think about how does a single person go to work every day versus how does a father or a mother with children go to work every day. There's a different mindset. There's a different set of ambitions, I think, as well.
Well, I think that's true, and I think that one has to remember that single women are now the key constituency of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And single women and their concerns, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be paid attention to, but they are very different than those of women who are married with children. They just have a very, very different point of view. And economically, long term, what you're going to end up with is this is one of the problems that both Japan and Germany are already facing, which is you have a large population of people now in their 40s and 50s who never had kids. Yeah. And so they're not making the kind of investments that you would make for children, and it has a political effect. Since it's kind of après moi le deluge. You don't really care. I can't afford to be totally pessimistic because I have kids. I just can't.
Yeah.
I can't. The idea that my children are going to live much worse than me is unacceptable. But I've sat with editors in New York who don't have kids, and they say, so what? I don't care. I've got it good. I'm doing well. And anyway, human beings are ruining the planet, so maybe if they're poorer, they won't be such a problem.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think if you look at, just think about that campaign cartoon, The Life of Julia, and then also when one thinks about the response to the disclosure from The Economist, it's at the University of Chicago, I think it was, who just kind of looked and did the numbers, how Obamacare decreases incentives to work, decreases working hours, and the response is, well, that's good for us. We'll be able to stay home more, which is characteristically un-American. The idea of declining work opportunities. I want to ask you a related question. So, what about fracking? I mean, and this is maybe a larger question in terms of predicting the future, predicting the next generation of economic industrial growth. Something like fracking was unthinkable. Equally so, something like Silicon Valley in its IT form was unthinkable, it seems to me. And yet they both emerged and they both have had disruptive effects. So is fracking a way to think about a major manufacturing industrial innovation that could break the logjam, as it were, of this ruling class?
Well, I think it's going to be part of what's going on, and of course it's very geographical. In other words, very hard even for a Democrat to be anti-energy in Houston or Dallas. Okay, I mean, but you can be anti-energy if you're in California, even though California has a lot of oil and gas. We're too good to exploit it. So I think that fracking is an interesting countertrend, and it's interesting that it's taken place under an administration that is basically hostile to it and hostile to fossil fuel energy. And of course, the reason it's been able to do well in certain parts of the country is that the land, the regulations are much easier if it's privately owned land. As we know, the public lands have been pretty much off limits to a lot of this.
Yeah.
So, fracking is one of those things that is, if you will, a counterfactual here. Yeah. It really goes against the idea that I think if you look at the ideology of, the green elements of the Democratic Party, their idea is energy is, we're going to run out of oil and gas. There's going to be tremendous scarcity. Price of energy is going to go way up, and it really is a kind of politics based on the idea of scarcity. Well, if you have a politics based on scarcity, there are only two things you can really do. One, you can have diminishing quality of life, which is probably one part of it, and then the other part of it is you're going to have to redistribute in an economy that's not growing.
Yeah.
So you and in many ways, that's the Democratic Party, unfortunately, today. It's really the party of redistribution on the one side, and a considerable acceptance of a lower quality of life for the majority of people. I mean, in other words, when somebody gets up there and say, well, people shouldn't live in single-family homes; they should live in little apartments.
Yeah.
Well, I think most people would think that's a big decline in your quality of life.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there are people who like living that way, and they should be perfectly happy to live that way. But if you're saying, as we see here in California, well, we don't want to build any more single-family homes. People have to live in apartments, and they shouldn't drive. They should take the bus to work. On a grassroots basis, that is a huge diminishment in the quality of life of people, and that I think is really part of what we're seeing, which is that the Democratic Party, which I have been a member of, since I was 18. Used to be committed to upward mobility and a better life for the middle class and better opportunities for the poor and for the working class. I don't think that's the central issue anymore. I think the issue in a good part of the Democratic Party is how do you manage scarcity, and basically how do you redistribute enough so that people have a basically decent standard of living, so you don't have riots and you don't have you have nothing to be guilty about. But you mentioned the life of Julia. I found that to be in many ways the scariest of all the things that came out of the Obama administration, because its view of life, like Julia, is dependent on the government at every stage of her life, even though she's portrayed as a competent professional. And then I love the little thing where Julia decides to have a child. We never hear about the guy, or I mean, I don't know whether she had immaculate conception, but somehow all of a sudden there's this kid. The kid goes off to preschool, and we never hear about him again.
Yeah, no, I mean it's creepy as well, because utopian ideologies never can make sense of the family. And so I found that to be the creepiest element of it. It seems also, just picking up on this, you note, really having those who are concerned about family decline, because, right, maybe singles, you could herd them into high-density apartments. They're really not going to be as aggravated about it as opposed to a family with 3 children.
Right.
And so this question of family decline is significant, because those also are going to be the people who are most concerned about economic growth.
Right.
And yet, so we're having the wrong debate. You suggest about, we really had kind of a social conservative debate, but what really needs to happen is policies that enable family formation and encourage marriage, and economic policies. And I guess it seems to be one group that's emerging. I don't know if you have any thoughts on them. Are the reform conservatives who have, I think, tried to articulate policies in this direction?
Yeah, no, and I think that, like, some of the more interesting ideas, like, for instance, here's an idea which will probably get me fired from some of my publications, but I don't understand why capital gains is taxed at a lower rate than income. I just don't get it. I don't see what the justice is there. Why don't, and at least some reform conservatives like Camp have at least raised the idea, why don't we lower income tax rates and raise the capital gains rates? We now know that having this capital gains policy is doing nothing for the middle class. We know it. It's absolutely clear. Now, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, maybe lowering capital gains did have a positive effect. But, when I think of the guys at WhatsApp, was it 50 people getting $19 billion, and they're taxed at a rate 14 points below mine?
Yeah.
You tell me what possibly gained. That's one of the reasons why we have this insane economy. I just saw something, Snapchat, another little tech company, valued at $10 billion. They have no revenues.
Yeah. Well, I think, of course, the idea of being double taxation, being why you would lower capital gains, but that seems to just raise the question, why not lower corporate taxes, which are the incidence of that tax. Most economists would argue is primarily borne by employees. Maybe just in wrapping up, I just want to think, so this has kind of been a pessimistic interview in a way. It's I won't say it's a pessimistic book, but it's a book that raises alarm, I think appropriately so. So looking forward, how do you see the landscape shaping up socially, culturally, politically with the ruling class? Are they further entrenching themselves, or are there or do you see sources, institutions, ideas that at least kind of shake them up a little bit?
Well, I think that one thing is that the digital technology has the ability to disperse economic assets and information, and we need to really see that takes place. One of my fears is down the road that you may get a Google or an Apple, basically, essentially so dominating the internet that you have to go through them to get there. I think we forget that the internet was created by the taxpayers of the United States. Google and Apple should have no more power on the internet than any individual should have, and that it should be like a highway that the taxpayers paid for, and you shouldn't say, well, this truck can go on this but you have to do this, and this truck can't. The problem is the tremendous promise of this age is being squandered, and I think we're going to have to come up with policies. I don't know if I have all of them, but or even some of them, but we're going to have a policy which parallels in its effect, not the same policies that we did when we passed the antitrust laws, when we curbed the powers of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, which had to happen. I look at history from a cyclical point of view, and there are times when certain private interests need to be, in some ways, restrained, and there are periods where you don't want to restrain them. And I think we're moving into an era where we have enormous concentrations. You look at the Comcast merger. I think this is one of the scariest things of all. I mean, you're going to end up with, a very small number of companies completely dominating the dissemination of media. This is very, very scary stuff. And the challenge, I think, for more conservative people is to understand that you can't continue this way. The one thing that may wake them up is the guys on the other side are against you, and there is no reason why they will not just settle in, very much like what you have in France, and be very closely in bed with the government and academia, and basically say, we're going to basically control everything that's done. And my hope is that Americans are still Americans, and they will find different ways to get around it, and they will continue to try to make creative destruction happen. I would love to see somebody compete with Google. I'd love to see somebody compete with Microsoft. I'd love to see all sorts of interesting startups that are independently owned. I'd like to see capital more available to small-scale entrepreneurs instead of to large hedge funds. How you get there is going to be complicated. But I think if we go on the course we're on now, we're going to have an America for our children that is nothing like the America we grew up in.
Joel Kotkin, thank you so much. A question we didn't get to, which is on my mind, is even after the revelations of the NSA surveillance partnerships in Silicon Valley, no real public opinion turn against these companies. Something I wanted to raise with you but didn't get a chance to. Joel Kotkin, we've been discussing his latest book, The New Class Conflict. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.